Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Antony.
And this is Words and Numbers. What's new and exciting in your world this week?
Switzerland-based aerospace company Destinus is working on its third prototype of a hydrogen-powered plane. Now be careful here, because actually nothing is hydrogen-powered. You use electricity to split hydrogen from water, and you use fossil fuel typically to generate the electricity. So really, anything that's hydrogen-powered is, in actual fact, fossil fuel-powered. But nonetheless, the hydrogen stores a tremendous amount of energy in a small and light space, and that's what's needed because this third prototype is expected to be able to fly from New York to San Francisco in 90 minutes. Now stop and reflect on where we've come. In the 1780s, a horse and wagon took 5 months to make that trip. By 1850, you could sail. You had to go around Cape Horn in South America, but that took 90 days, New York to San Francisco. By 1869, we had the Transcontinental Railroad, and you could do New York to San Francisco in 4 days. By 1986, Interstate 80 was completed, and you could do New York to San Francisco in 48 hours if you had a friend and you were driving nonstop. Today, a nonstop flight, 6.5 hours. So, that hydrogen plane that would do New York to San Francisco in 90 minutes reduces the travel time versus the 1780s horse and wagon by 99.96%. All in just 250 years of technological progress.
I want to get us back to partisanship in the media. It turns out that there is one cable channel that is respected on both sides of the aisle. Democrats and Republicans love it equally. It's the Weather Channel. Everybody trusts the Weather Channel, and the Weather Channel does its level best to be apolitical. Maybe it's time for other channels to declare their apolitical nature and proceed accordingly. I do, from time to time, turn on the TV and remark at the end of a half-hour show that, wow, there was no garbage politics in that at all. Isn't that refreshing? As things become more politicized, and here I'm thinking most specifically of TV and movies, the American people tune out. They don't want it. You would think that profit-seeking entities would take note of that sort of behavior, and yet they don't. But I throw it out there, pay attention to the Weather Channel. There's actually a lesson to be learned there. Which brings me to the foolishness of the week, and this is more like an outrage of the week. I know about math, and I know the numbers aren't overwhelming here, but letter carriers, the mailmen are being robbed. Can't we just leave the mailman alone? I mean, for the love of God, is nothing sacred to you people? Leave the mailman be. He's like the last beacon of happiness on an otherwise deserted shore, and yet people want to go steal from him.
For one-stop shopping for all things James and Ant, visit our website, wordsandnumbers.org.
Before we get started, and this is the promised continuation of the how much do Americans make discussion that we had a while back, it might do us well to stipulate what kinds of data are even available. We're not going to be able to find households headed by males of Polish descent born between 1950 and 1960. There is a point where it gets too granular and you don't get it.
Yeah, that's right. And if you remember from our previous discussion, there are all sorts of different metrics we can look at for income. Only some of them are tracked on the basis of race and gender. Even those that are tracked on the basis of race and gender, while gender is a simpler thing to deal with race you've got this problem, and you can see it in the data. Back in the 1950s, 1960s, it was whites, blacks, other. And then later on, Hispanics showed up. And so it was blacks, not Hispanic, comma, other, comma, Hispanic. And then you get probably starting around the 1990s, 1980s, Asian shows up as its own classification. And then you have the problem now of you have to present people with multiple options and
Sure.
They choose. On the one hand, you can get data on black. On the other, you can get data on people who check the black box along with other boxes also. So it all becomes very complicated.
Sure. And let's be real clear, because I can already hear the hate mail. No, we're not saying that Asians showed up in the 1980s. We're saying that Asians showed up in the data in the 1980s.
The data, right. Census started counting
That's
them.
right. Your beef is with the Census Bureau, not with us. And yet that last thing that you hit, Ant, that's where it gets really interesting, right? Because once upon a time, black and white, that's what you needed, right? Two big classifications. I don't know what makes a person black anymore.
Right. And if you look at the census data, it kind of comes down to whatever the person says he is. It's what box you decided to check.
And here you go, because you just opened a gigantic can of worms, and that can of worms was named Rachel Dolezal. Do you remember this woman who just decided one day she was black and took on a life of a black activist?
She ended up like head of the local chapter of the NAACP or something.
Yeah, only we later found that she was a milky white girl who was operating with some very strange ideas. And yet that's kind of the issue right now, isn't it? We land on this idea of self-identification, and I don't necessarily think that's a bad way to go. What are you is a question I think we could and maybe even should ask. And yet you see the problem, because people are going to answer it in all kinds of strange and wondrous ways.
And I take this, while it's a complete headache when it comes to the data, I take it as a sign of something good that's happening. So this has been over the past 50 to 70 years? We've gone from cut and dried black-white to all kinds of gradations, and you choose what it is. Move that trend forward another 100 years, and the question won't even matter.
Yeah, I think we're already kind of getting there, right? When you look around and people are just generally less white than they once were. When you see how people are choosing to breed, I guess would be the technically correct word to use, you start to see how this becomes less relevant over time. Because each generation, it becomes a little harder to declare with any kind of certainty, I am X. Unless X is a whole bunch of stuff all mixed up together.
I see that trend most markedly with the LGBTQ plus group. Over time, they keep adding letters. And as they add letters, it occurs to me what people are doing, they're all putting their hands up saying, no, I want to be counted also. Ultimately, you run that to the end, and we're all individuals. And I think that's beautiful.
Yeah, I think be careful, because that's not where they're going with this. It may be where they end up, but it's certainly not where they're trying to go. Race is bad enough, and then we're going to throw gender in on top of it. And as I often do, if I can declare myself to be a black woman and everybody else just has to say, well, I guess James is a black woman now, we may have gotten to the point where the data is somewhat meaningless. Nonetheless, we persist, because we're not there yet and the data is not meaningless.
Let's begin by talking about gender disparity, because this is the thing that people talk about quite often.
Let me say it, Ant, women make 77 cents for every dollar that men make.
Yeah, I can tell you an even worse story than that.
Please do.
If you look at per capita money, and this is a technical measure, per capita money income is around 50% higher for men than for women in the United States, 50% higher. Per capita money income is all sources of monetary income that someone would earn, so we're not counting employer-paid benefits here. All sorts of money income a person would earn, but what's important here, when you see this per capita note on it, per capita money income, they're counting everybody. That is, people who are working, people who are unemployed, people who are retired, people who are working part-time. And that's kind of not what we think of when we think of the gender wage gap. We tend to think of full-time working men versus full-time working women. We have a measure for that. It's called usual earnings. And if you look at usual earnings for men versus women, the men are about 20% higher. That's that 20 cents on the dollar that people talk about.
But 50% sounds a whole lot worse.
Well, it really does. But I think what's going on there, and you can see this in the numbers, there's a larger fraction of women who are not in the labor force versus men. I believe the difference is something like 20%. 20% more males in the labor force than females. So, of course, if you're not in the labor force, you're not earning anything, and you're showing up as a zero when people run the calculations. So I think that's largely what's driving that 50% delta.
So per capita gets to be a real problem here, even though it's exactly what you want to measure.
Well, yeah, I don't think per capita is what we really want, because when people talk about wage disparity, in their minds, they're picturing two people who are doing the same kind of work. They're full-time, employed. When you talk about that, that's what we call usual earnings. And there, the men are 20% higher than the women. Now, there have been a number of studies done. Our friend Steve Horwitz has done a number of them himself, showing that if you don't compare men to women, but rather compare men to women in the same field, with the same education, with the same job experience, that 20-cent delta goes away largely. It doesn't entirely go away. I think it's still like a 2% or 5%
There's 2 or 3
difference.
cents left there, no matter what you want to do.
I think so.
Which has always seemed fascinating. You see these studies on negotiating ability of men versus women, and how men seem to be able to negotiate better for whatever the reason. And where would the delta come? It would, I think, come from jobs at the very high end of the chain. Executive jobs where individual negotiations actually matter.
That's a possibility. There's something else I ran across as I'm looking at wage data, and I'm looking here at the amount by which the typical person's earnings rise year after year. The average is 1.2% faster than inflation. So if you're working, you can expect on average that you get raises that are 1.2% better than inflation. Now, picture a male, for example, starting at age, 20, and working for 45 years. And getting these 1.2% better than inflation raises. By the time this person retires, the person's earning about twice as much as he was earning when he entered the job market. Now, picture a woman, same deal. And let's suppose the woman's raises match exactly the male's. For every year that she's working, she gets a 1.2% better than inflation raise. She starts at the same point, age 20, working at the same wage as the male. Everything the same as a male with one exception. She takes a year off after having a kid, a hiatus. A 1-year hiatus means a 1 percentage point difference between her and the male. If you take a 5-year hiatus, you're now talking about a 5 to 6 percentage point difference. And that persists all the way through. I submit that you get into a feedback loop here. If, for example, you have a married couple, male, female, they're both earning the exact same amount, they get the same raises, and they have a kid, and the woman takes a year off. She's now earning 1% less than the male. When it comes time to make a choice about moving, they could move for a higher pay for the male, or they could stay there at their current job and where the woman is earning what she's earning. If the male is earning more, it makes sense to follow the male. If he's getting a raise, he's getting a raise on top of the more that he's earning. And what does that do? That breaks the woman's career a second time.
The interesting thing here would be to see if anybody's ever looked at the earnings over a lifetime of women who never had children. If this is the variable that really matters, well, there are lots of women who don't have children. We could probably find the data.
I'm going to throw a wrench in the works here. It has to be more than a woman who's never had children. It has to be a woman who can't have children.
Oh, geez, yeah, that might be right.
And it has to be obvious to the employer. Here's why. If the law is requiring the employer to provide maternity leave for the woman, that's a cost. And if I'm an employer, anytime I hire a woman, I know that there's this possibility of this cost out there. I'm going to price that into the wage.
Yeah.
When will I not do that? If I know that the woman can't have children.
So we've thought about men and women, and oddly enough, we haven't solved that problem to everybody's satisfaction.
Let's make other people mad
Yeah,
by
okay.
talking about
How
blacks
could we
versus
move
whites.
on? That's right. Let's go piss off a bunch of other people.
The median wage for white males is around 30% higher than it is for black males, and also about 30% higher than it is for Hispanic males. That's a big gap.
I'm going to say something everybody's going to hate. Are you ready?
Go for it.
Black men die so young.
Well, I did some numbers on that, actually.
How about that? Nice to see that we're all on the same page here.
It turns out...
And just so people know, we don't plan these things out. We just show up.
Let's take a 20-year-old man. 20-year-old white man can expect to live to age 76, going by the current demographics. 20-year-old black man can expect to live until age 69. That's a 7-year difference.
If you want to find the real problem, you just found it.
I think the problem shows up, it doesn't show up in the wages, but it shows up markedly in Social Security benefits. The average Social Security retirement check is $2,400 per month, roughly $30,000 a year.
But it's going to show up in wages. Black men are not living to retirement. The period of years when, comparatively speaking, they would have been making the most money in their entire careers,
what you're saying.
They die.
Oh, yeah, of course. I didn't consider that. Sure. Okay, so if the life expectancy is lower for black men, forget about going into retirement, they're going to be dying earlier across the entire age spectrum.
That's right.
Which means there's going to be progressively fewer and fewer of them relative to white men at the later earning years when your salary is the highest.
That's right.
Oh, very good, James. Very good. You got your economist star for the day.
That's right. I'm an economist now, baby. Don't you worry. But think about the profound effect that would have on the data.
Yeah.
And I don't think this is the case, but it could be the case that individual blacks are making exactly as much as individual whites.
Right, but the fact that they're dying before they're reaching their peak earning is at least in part driving these numbers. I thought you were going to Social Security, and that's what I have the data on here. The average Social Security retirement check's $2,400 a month, or roughly $30,000 a year. Life expectancy for the typical white male, 76, typical black male, 69. That's a 7-year difference. 7 times $30,000 a year, that's $210,000 that the average black male will not be receiving in Social Security benefits that the average white male will be receiving simply because the average white male lives longer.
And you see that this is going to start popping up in all kinds of strange ways in the data. If you really want to look for a disparity, the disparity isn't the money. That's a byproduct of the real disparity, which is in years of living.
Yeah.
We may have a much bigger problem that nobody even bothers talking about.
And I really like your point about dropping out before you hit the peak earning years. But that's going to be one factor. Another factor, you can see this, and it tracks income differences across race. Education. Number of whites versus blacks who go to college, who graduate with degrees. Job type. Number of whites versus blacks who end up in managerial or professional jobs. And also the unemployment rate. I have no doubt that they're all interrelated. Now, as to what causes what and what mutually causes other things, I don't know. Let me shift this whole train into reverse, because up until this point...
Wait a second. You mean that we're going to piss off fewer people, not more people?
I'm going to leave everybody scratching their heads now. What we've said so far, and this is just looking at the data, that males earn more than females, and we gave some arguments at least to why we might expect that, and there are probably other things as well. Why blacks earn less than whites and why we might expect that, and there are other things that might play in as well. And of course, in the back of everybody's minds is, well, you haven't talked about discrimination. Clearly, there's gender discrimination, there's racial discrimination. Except, entered the Asian female. The average Asian female earns more than the average white male.
Get the out of here.
Yeah, the average Asian female earns 7.5% more than the average white male.
Wow.
If there's gender bias and if there's racial bias, we shouldn't be seeing that number.
Asians have always presented a bit of a difficulty. They are an ethnic minority in the United States, and yet they seem not to be discriminated against.
Well, we need to look only back to the 1940s when we were throwing them in concentration camps in this country.
Well, or the 1920s when we were working on the railroads. There are all kinds of problems here, and I think the same sorts of difficulties in the data are going to emerge if we consider where Jews fit into the grand scheme of things as well. Very much an ethnic minority, and yet they seem to succeed no matter what. To make the case that we have systemic racism that works against ethnic minorities, well, we've got a couple of examples here that work in the opposite direction. So maybe that's not right. Maybe we have systemic racism that works only against one or two ethnic minorities.
Possibly.
Then you've got harder questions to answer, right? Why them and not the others? I don't pretend to know what the answer is to that question.
I could give a counter-argument that goes along the lines of the Asian female data doesn't tell us anything because we may still be discriminating against Asian females. And because of that discrimination, they're only earning 7.5% more than white males instead of 20% more than white males.
That's right. They should be earning way more than they already do, which is already way more than white males earn.
I think now you end up with an unfalsifiable hypothesis.
That's exactly the problem. We're on very strange ground here. You and I tend not to get to racial issues all that often. It's always one of those things where there's more heat than light. As angry as anybody might happen to be, given what we've already said, these are the numbers.
Even with pointing to the numbers, I'm not entirely sure what to take away from them, other than the fact that nothing is cut and dried here. The only thing that's obvious to me is that you can't point to the numbers and say, aha, here's evidence of racism, or here's evidence of gender bias.
You can't say here's definitive evidence of racism.
Yeah, I can certainly interpret it that way, but I could also interpret it other ways, and then we've got the Asian female that throws all of my interpretations out the window.
And should work on everybody else's too, right? Everybody should say, well, that's strange. What's up with that? Instead of getting hot and bothered and saying, I'm going to talk only about the one thing I care about. There's a very rich tapestry sitting right in front of us. Maybe everybody should be a little more fascinated by what we all see.
I'll tell you one other thing. If you trace this data, these wage gaps that we've been talking about, I've got data that goes from 1970 up to the present, what you find is that they're slowly but surely disappearing. We may end up in a very weird space that by the time we have data that will definitively answer the question, the numbers may have just turned, and that whatever the delta is now gone.
The real question is not if there is one, but why there is one, and if that's acceptable. And if not, what are we going to do about it? And if in doing something about it, we violate somebody else's rights some other way. This is very complicated stuff, and you can't just wave a magic wand and make things go away. And if you could, what would you make go away anyway? Because my takeaway from today is that I would really like black men to live longer. I'm not sure that that's other people's takeaway.
Right. I don't know to what extent, but I think it would make a significant difference.
Yeah.
At the very least, the number that popped out at me was at $210,000 that they're losing out on in Social Security retirement versus white males.
And that has a further reach than you might think when you think about the families that are left behind and how they benefit from what's been earned over time. And there's no sugarcoating that. That's a real difficulty. You know, I know you're in the business of putting dollar amounts to human life, but you can't really do that. A life is priceless when it comes right down to it.
We all say that. We tend not to act that way, and economists usually get shown the door when we point that out.
That's right, because you're a bunch of soulless bastards, and nobody wants to hear from you when we think about these sorts of things.
I'm taking your economist star back, James.
Anyway, by the time I tell you to go stuff, we're probably finished. So on that happy note, I take my leave of you. And that's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Until next time, be sure to follow us on Twitter. Handles are in the show notes. Join Words and Numbers Backstage, the Facebook group where the conversation continues, and
send us email, wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
Until next week, try to be nice to one person who doesn't deserve it. Just one. And who knows, it may turn into a trend. Give it a shot. You might feel good about yourself.
You could say you tried.
You tried, that's right. Till next week, can't take it easy.
See you next week, James.